Thank you very much, and I'd like to say good morning to everyone. Very good. I have good news for you to begin with. I think that all my germs are starting to leave me. I feel much better this morning. I hope you don't hatch them, though. I hope they don't go and live with you after they leave me. So, thank you, the Theology Commission, for having did the compilation and collected all of the questions from the group. They were given to me last night. I thought that they were going to give me 1, 2, maybe 3 questions max. Look at the questions. I've got more than 20 here. Therefore, I spent the night asking myself, how am I going to deal with this? So, I'd like to propose the following to try and answer. I don't know if I'll answer all of the questions, but at least the majority. I tried to bring the questions together and cluster them around. Okay. It's a little bit better, but we're just fixing the microphone for her now. Very good. So I tried to cluster the questions around the end of the conclusion that I came to yesterday morning. And then we had Laudato Si and we had the Gospel. And I was able to propose 3 elements to try and look at this imagination. And I wanted to look at how autonomy and our thought of interdependence, for this model of interdependence, how prosperity might be looked at in forms of communion, and how exactly the future might be looked at as being open and receptive to the future, the unknown. So anyway, those are the kind of like the 3 main clusters I used: interdependence, communion, and the unknown, or the unexpected, let's say. And I tried to classify the questions around the 3 words, because it would seem to me that they kind of sent us back in one way or another, always, all the questions, to these 3 words. And I also identified 3 types of questions. We have questions that require a specific action, making things very concrete. So can you tell us in a more concrete manner, they asked, something about this, that, or the other thing, or what are you meaning when you talk about such and such a concept, which are sometimes a little bit abstract. So you're asking me to be more practical, more concrete. The second series was questions of understanding and of clarification, and questions of kind of like a reflection or deepening. So these are more conceptual in nature. What can we deepen? What could you clarify with us? So like I was saying, these are questions more of a matter of understanding. And my third level of questions, I put them together as the possibility to kind of like bring into connection all of these major concepts which you talked about with religious life, okay? So yesterday afternoon I tried to make that link, but there were more questions. Could we go a little bit further in that idea, with that idea, the idea of the link with religious life? So anyway, I've got kind of like 2 major series. I've got my 3 words, and I've got my 3 forms of questions I've given you, and the 3 types of questions, and I tried to fill in my chart. I made a chart, kind of like a 2-fold chart. Look at my chart here. Okay, there it is. And I'm going to use my chart to help me to peruse rather quickly what it is I came to share with you. So before we enter into the content of each one of these 3 words and the 3 types of questions, what I'm going to do is 3 times 3. So I will take each one of the words, and for each one of these words, I will try to look at each one of these types of questions. So in passing, just to help us understand before we enter into the subject matter as such, because it's a little bit like kind of like a reaction or an echo to what I heard the first day. that is for you kind of like a notion that is being lived, very important for you in a religious life, and that's the whole intercultural dimension of your lives. And from the very first day that I presented myself, I told you I'm kind of fashioned myself, right, by the cultures of my own country of origin from the south, and then living in the north of France. So this way of thinking, therefore, or of thinking or reflecting that I'm going to share with you, and that I did start to talk about yesterday with you, is for me a way to demonstrate how I manage this intercultural reality, how I bring the two ideas together, because I always need a framework. See, I always work in threes. I always think in terms of three. So 3 times 3, right? And I also need like a framework. And I'm thinking that this framework, the fact that we always have a reflection framework, this is something that I received from the French culture. The very Cartesian type of logic that we follow. We will separate out, classify, put order in, and it's very rich to help us to think through reality. And I think that I do owe a lot to that culture. Within that framework, then, I kind of like call on my imagination, and I reread the concepts. And I think that at that moment, what I do is I kind of like draw from my culture of the South, which is more of a circular type of thought process. And so within that framework, I tell you little stories. I told you a lot of stories yesterday. And I make links, but it's a framework. This makes it possible for me not to go off in every which way, every which direction. So it helps me to try and maintain a certain level of coherence between all of these elements that are of a different order. So that is just to tell you that I think that when we think of intercultural, the challenge is mainly for us to think of this summary synthesis that is not just words in just juxtaposition, juxtaposed words. And so I would say it is to create a new culture. The synthesis that I created within myself doesn't correspond exactly with one or the other of my cultures. It's my summary of the two, and therefore my synthesis of the two. And so we are called, therefore, to build up this type of collective synthesis between different cultures. And so that is kind of my own personal experience. But I think that today, in this world that is more and more always connected and interconnected, right? And that we have all of these different cultures now that we are confronted with, that we live with, we have to get beyond. And we heard that the first day. The intercultural is not multicultural. It is not to put one culture next to the other side by side, but it's to see how they can fertilize one another, how they can be fruitful with one another. And so this is how I came to the results of my reflection, based on your questions, of course. That is somewhat colored by my own two cultures of belonging. So now let me enter into the subject matter as such. So I'd like to begin with the idea of interdependence. You know, that sends us back to the idea that everything is related, right? And that the whole is greater than the parts. So that's kind of like the idea that I want to talk about when I look at it from the question of interdependence. This autonomy as interdependence and self-sufficiency, dependency, you know, making the distinction between all of them. Therefore, I'm going to begin by... I always begin with a little story, of course, in order to respond to this request of making things more practical, more concrete, and how we can, let's say, incarnate or enflesh this experience of interdependence. And so now I'm going to do this with a little story, which for me answers one of the questions that was asked Yesterday I talked to you about the Holy Father that asked us to think of the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth, and that we put them together. They are just one call. And I said to somebody said, how can you bring the two of them together? I was asked. Anyway, for me, I think that's what we could talk about when we talk about interdependence. My story, or my illustration, talks about an experience lived in a monastery. So, around the question of the ecology in France, I work with an experience that is carried out in a group of monasteries, okay? Monasteries where these monasteries, in the greater part, were living agricultural, or living off agricultural activities, and were challenged by Laudato Si with regards to their agricultural practices. Anyway, I'm going to talk about permaculture. Permaculture is very practical. It's something that is not a way of exploiting the earth, but people who practice this, they say, and defend it, they say it's a way of life, a philosophy of life, and is founded on the idea that we will try to develop complementarity between the plants instead of producing, everything separately, different plants. It's all based and founded on complementarity. Anyway, so I'm working with these monasteries that, based on this permaculture that I was talking about, they ask themselves questions regarding their monastic life. And so how they ask me, can we enter into this invitation that is made to us by the Holy Father in Laudato Si? Anyway, so this is one of the monasteries that is at the origin of this process. In Maïlis, it's the monastery of Maïlis in the south of France. And so they produce a medicinal plant, and they've produced it like on an industrial level, with a lot of chemicals, a classical way of producing. So they started thinking about the idea that maybe we would have to look at a new way of production. And anyway, the brother who was in charge of that was really interested in permaculture, and he wanted this transformation to happen, particularly this plant. There was a kind of like they had got like the plants had become sick, like a germ or something, some kind of germ, and so they couldn't find the time or get the resources necessary to make this huge change, okay? And they knew they had to do something. Anyway, one day at the monastery, we rang at the doorbell, but the brother who was at the reception desk was busy, so he wasn't there. So we said, listen, can you go for him because he's not there? So anyway, he came and he said he wasn't very happy to go, and he was dragging his feet. He said, that's not my job to be at the reception desk, and that's not what I should be doing. So he opens the door, and you know how that happens, eh? It happens in communities, right? Like that. Anyway, he goes and he opens the door, and there is a man there. You know, these people who go from monastery to monastery, who are poor and who are homeless and go from place to place, and sometimes they ask for a bit of time to be with the monks and to stay for a day or two or three, and in exchange he said, I'm ready to render service. Anyway, he said, okay, what am I going to give him to do now and all that? So he said, I'll put him out in the fields and I'll let him start doing things that I haven't had the time to do, said the monk. Try and get the earth ready so that we can get this permaculture going. So I told him what to do, and he went. Finally, when he came back to him at the end of the day, it's quite impressive, he worked so well. And all of a sudden he said, well, now we can go further with this. So today, this man was hired by the monastery. He's receiving his salary, and this whole process of conversion to permaculture got off to a good start, thanks to this little disturbance, let's say, of the man coming to the door, and made it possible then for us to get something going and to find resources where we weren't expecting at all. cry of the earth, cry of the poor. They go together. I see there the association of both human poverty, and surely the brother would never have dreamed that he would have gotten permaculture beginning with the monastery that came to ask just for a place to come and be with for a few days. And they never thought they'd find somebody who had skills and was able to do that. So anyway, the chance presented itself, and he took it. So the two poverties, I can say, kind of like become associated. They kind of like knit together and they become a resource. And I think that that's what we have behind the idea of interdependence, our human poverty, and poverty in nature. And I'm also thinking that we are invited to do, when we talk about this idea of interdependence, of bringing together earth, human poverty and poverty of the earth, it is exactly to bring together what generally we would have taken up or dealt with in a very compartmentalized fashion, with projects where we would search to respond to human poverty, where we would take up the ecological questions or environmental questions with techniques and things like that. And the idea is to try and bring them all together, and that we take them up and we work at them in a completely separate fashion. But it is the interdependence I'm talking about between human poverty and poverty of the earth, for me, is to broaden even more from what we say in Laudato Si, and it has to extend to every part of life. So I think we have lives that are very structured. Each one of us are kind of like specialized in one thing or another, in all of the communities and all of the works that we do as a group. You've got the liturgy specialists, you've got the catechists, you've got specialists in community life, and everybody's got their own little place of expertise. So anyway, what I'm thinking today is that we are invited to leave behind, go away, distance ourselves from these areas of expertise that are ours, to reach out to people who are not experts of the question, but who can give us the possibility of accessing new ways of thinking, and have us leave or come out of these places that sometimes close us in our way of doing things or in our own skills. So for me, interdependence is an invitation to decompartmentalize. So we're talking about life being organized, where each one is called to develop, to allow to develop a certain skill or competence. Everything is evaluated in terms of our skills, and we have to identify a specific one. So what that does, it kind of closes you off, because everybody's closed in their own area, their own label, their own way of doing things. And I'm thinking today that integral ecology is an invitation to leave, to step outside the box that we've created and create relationships, get things flowing, circulating. And so you have people like with these principles who are not the main experts, or people who are recognized or identified as being specialists in such and such an area. In any case, that's where what's behind this idea of interdependence. That's related to this little story of what happened with the permaculture question. And now in terms of understanding, I'd like to associate the word interdependence with another word. That is the word alliance, covenant. So I think it also makes it possible for me to, by so doing, answering another question, to see how interdependence changes our image of God. What a lovely question. Interdependence, how does it change our image of God? And I believe that it does change it. So I think that invites us to enter into another type of relationship with Him. And I think the word alliance is a beautiful word, this covenant that we speak about. The word alliance that we use in our profane language, but it's very central. This covenant is very central in the Bible. And I wanted to remind you of a little bit of a story, a little biblical story where we speak of this covenant, because I think it is a very strong kind of like echo to what we are saying. So it's in the book of Genesis, and I think you all know this story where we have the flood, right? And the humans weren't really doing all that well and weren't treating each other all that well. And God says, I'm going to send a flood, and there's only going to be one survivor, and it's going to be Noah. And he goes to Noah and he says, you know, I want to enter into a covenant with you, Noah. Do you remember when he says, I will enter into a covenant with you? He says, I promise you that I will never again destroy the earth with a flood. Strange, eh? He said, I want to enter into a covenant, and I'm going to make a promise at the same time. I will never again destroy the entire earth with a flood. So I would imagine that in that promise, we're speaking about the covenant, this alliance, because what God says, I will never again destroy the earth with a flood. He's in the process of saying, from now on, you are as responsible as I am for the well-being of this earth. So he sent the flood because people weren't treating it well and weren't treating each other very well. So among ourselves, there is no relationship, you know, you do well, I bless you. You don't do well, I punish you. Doesn't work anymore. Because now there is this covenant. Never again will I destroy the earth with a flood, he says. That is, we are co-responsible for the well-being of our earth. So this is the alliance or the covenant I'm talking about. And I believe that this is what we have in this idea of interdependence to which we are called. It is that we are called to become co-responsible, co-creators. Not to think of creation as juxtaposition of different things one next to the other, but to create covenants, enter into an alliance, interdependence. You know this word covenant, I worked on it a great deal. It's something that always fascinated me, especially when it's relationship with the economy. And so I worked a great deal on the differences between a contract and a covenant or an alliance. You know, in the world of the economy, we always speak of a contract. So in the contract, in both cases, it's an agreement, right? They're an exchange. The covenant, the alliance, the contract. But for me, the difference is that the contract is drawn up to protect ourselves from the other. It's a way of protecting ourselves from the risks that might be imposed upon me by the other. So we draw up a contract, a working contract, precisely for the fact that I would be respected and I would not be caught by the other person. For having an insurance contract or any type of contract. I mean, everything in life has a contract. And it's a way to protect ourselves, and it's very, very good because it protects the weakest. However, I believe that relationships cannot be limited to contractual types of relationships. The covenant asks us to think differently. I think that this covenant is a relationship in which we do not protect ourselves from the other, but that we accept to risk with the other. We don't protect ourselves from the risks that others might impose upon us or have us enter into, but we trust and we say to the other, if you fail, your failure is my failure, and if you succeed, your success is my success. This is huge. It's just big, so big. So anyway, that's totally different from the contract, because interdependence, as far as I'm concerned, is this desire to create relationships that are alliances, that are covenants with each other. This alliance or this covenant allows us to, like I said, step out of the box. This places of comfort and skills and where we feel that we are experts. And so that's for the interdependence. With the little story on the permaculture question, our understanding of the question of covenant, and the third question is the relationship with religious life. So we've already talked about this yesterday, and for me, this idea of interdependence, I know very well, kind of like as an echo, with the vow of poverty. So we're talking about the vow of poverty now. You know, yesterday I was saying that poverty isn't necessarily the fact of having very little or living with hardly nothing, but it's to rather be free. Free, kind of like a certain freedom with regards to things. And so it is an invitation to us to freedom. And so I think maybe to translate that in into something concrete, I think that poverty could be thought of in keeping with this whole question of material management within the community. So a few ideas as to how this poverty might be thought of in terms of interdependence with material things. Well, I would say the following. You know, when we purchase things, how do we decide what we're going to buy? I heard, and I don't know if that's your case, but sometimes in religious congregations, the vow of poverty is to try and buy that which is cheapest, the least expensive. You know, we want to be poor, we want simplicity, so go and buy something that's not expensive. But sometimes when you buy what's least expensive, oftentimes you're just doing the total opposite of what you want to do with the vow of poverty, because to buy what is least expensive is to kind of say, I'm sure that the producer was not paid a proper salary, and maybe when you pay what's least expensive, it could be that which is produced unjustly. So that's what I mean to talk about interdependence, to make sure that when you purchase something, I think, who produced this? What were the working conditions this person was in? How did how was this producer paid, remunerated? Did we respect the environment or not? So I'm thinking of all of the links that we have, or all of these links that we have in our choices for consumer goods. So there you go for purchases. Let me talk yesterday about financial investments. That's the same thing. It is to ask ourselves, you know, when we decide on our financial investments in community, to think, what is this money going to be used for? I'm investing the money, and I have this idea, and I want to have a good level of interest, right? I want to invest, but I want to get something back to be able to pay for things that are very good, kind of like the life of the community, the projects, the works of the congregation, and the rest. And so we invest it so that we can get a rate of return that is a good positive rate of interest. So anyway, I think that this interdependence means, and to ask ourselves, how was this interest created? Who used and who benefited from the money that I put in the bank, that I invested, and that I bought certain shares or whatever? So how was this money invested? How was it used? Like I was saying yesterday, we have to set certain ethical criteria for the businesses, the companies the firms where we invest our money. Just the idea that you have ethical principles is all policies is very important. But we can do more than that. I tried to tell you that yesterday afternoon, but I'll come back upon it now, because we could invest this money not in big funds and in big business, but maybe invest this money in little projects with people who don't have the possibility of getting a whole lot of money or a loan from the bank, and who would want to develop something that would help them economically, a project. So anyway, with that money, we create an alliance, okay? We enter into an alliance with another person who wants to develop a project, who doesn't have the means to do so, and doesn't have the means to access money from the classic system in place. So we have this money and we use it by hoping, that it is going to produce some interest, generate interest. But you see, we become the partner of the person who's going to be using our money. We enter into a covenant with him or her. We risk with them, for sure. But this money is a means to enter into alliance with other. It's not just a means for funding, for financing the life of the institution, but it is to enter into a covenant with the other. So, you know, for me, that's how poverty could be associated with a life of in a religious congregation and with interdependence. And I would say a last thing about this regarding this, how to live interdependence in religious life. You know, oftentimes the economy, you know, we think it's just a question of secondary question, that in all of the communities there are treasurers. There might be treasurers here with you, eh? And we know that the treasurer, like we kind of consider her, or we think that it is kind of like a support system, but not really at the core, not at the heart of decision making at the community. It's the person who administers, who manages. And I think that these economic decisions are things that should touch the entire congregation. They can't be decisions of just one person, because these economic decisions are not just a question of management or administration. It's just not a question of financial performance, but it is, what do we want to bring to life? To whom do we want to be associated? To whom do we want to go to create this covenant? So what is behind our choices, whether it be for financial investments or for our consumer goods or whatever? That is what is behind all economic decisions. And for me, that decision in community life cannot be the responsibility of just one person. And I would even say not even the leadership team of the community. For me, these are questions that concern all of the community. And so that is a way, if you wish, to have us enter into interdependence in religious life through the possibility of the vow of poverty. So that's for the first thing, interdependence, first word. Good for everybody? Great. All right. Second word. Communion. I was saying that prosperity, is it possible to think of it not necessarily in terms of material well-being, but rather in terms of communion? And I'm thinking that's what Laudato Si is really inviting us to. Okay, so the first type of question, the concretization. But I'm going to tell you another story so you can understand. This time the story is an experience that I lived myself at L'Arche with John Vanier. I know that many of you know the communities, the L'Arche communities anyway. So I was at L'Arche, and this is a story of discovery for me. I discovered it not long ago, and together we lived an experience that for me transformed me, I would say, because L'Arche asked me to do some evaluation of their social usefulness. You know, in my work as a researcher, I work and I evaluate our social utility or usefulness. For me, our economy has to be looked at, evaluated from its relational perspective. That's the richness. But the problem is, it's easy to measure monetary wealth, but it's very difficult to measure the social or relational level. So for me, there is something that has to be done to see how we might identify, measure what we produce in terms of relationships or the quality of our relationships. So this is the main work that we have to do in the area of economy. So knowing that I was working on that, L'Arche asked me if we could evaluate our social usefulness at L'Arche. So anyway, it's very easy, and it didn't demonstrate it. L'Arche receives people who, in general, have been cast aside by society. But That's not what we're talking about, social usefulness. It's not to take on the responsibility for fragile people. But what I'm talking about is in the way that we do it at L'Arche, from this experience of community life with the people who are handicapped and not handicapped, what are we saying to society? What are we talking about? What are we projecting in the way of community to society? So what we said was in this study that the usefulness, the social usefulness or utility of L'Arche was in the way they experience their fragility. As I was saying, it's not something to be repaired, or to take charge of, but our fragility is what allows for us to create a relationship. Relationships that are carried out through developing of competence is not really a relationship, that's a contract. Whereas, in order for us to have a true relationship, we have to be able to accept, to share, to accept our relationship. So that is just to tell you the framework of my encounter with L'Arche. But anyway, I'm going to tell you about another experience now. You know, I did not know about the handicapped world at all. I was very surprised by this world that existed there, and in this world of mentally handicapped, there are so many unexpected, like every day, every minute, it's unexpected. So the little experience that I did have was at the very beginning of my time with them. L'Arche had asked me to talk about sustainable development in one of the meetings. They were celebrating their 45th anniversary. That was 5 years ago. So anyway, I organized a meeting with a group of persons, people who were handicapped and others who were, you know, taking care of them or with them, so that I could talk a little bit about this idea of sustainable development, because I didn't know exactly how they would react or what they would think about it. So I began the meeting and I said, does sustainable development mean anything to you? So one of these people answered and said, oh, yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, sustainable development, he said. In my community, he says, we had one television for the entire house. Now, we bought one television for each room. That's not sustainable. So I said, what is he trying to say to me? I thought about that. Okay, I understood. So what he's trying to tell me is that one television takes less energy than having a whole bunch of them in the house. So it's less sustainable because we're spending or we're expending more energy. No, he said. No, that's not it at all. Before, he says, after supper, all of us would go together to watch TV. Now, after supper, everybody goes into their own room to watch community, not sustainable. Do I need to talk about the community anymore? Or is that enough? He understood everything. So that's what community is. And there was a community that asked, there was a question here that asked, how can we think of kind of like a whole that isn't the sum of the parts? You know, the whole. There was a nice example. It's not all living together under the same roof, as this man made me realize, but what are these spaces, the places that allow us to truly be together? What are these spaces where there is something that circulates there, flows? It's not just to share the same space, but it's what's circulating, what's moving, what's happening in that space. So the community should be, I think, in my mind, what Jean-Jacques was trying to say. Instead of meeting, it's not just a place where we're just together. That's not, it's more than that. There were many questions on community. Many of them. in the ones that were given me. And there were many questions that sent us back to the question of dialogue, the experience of dialogue. I had spoken about that yesterday, because I think that that's one of the main elements in Laudato Si. So there were many questions on that one. So I'm thinking that the community should be a place of dialogue. But precisely, and that was something else I learned at l'Arche. You know, communication is just not verbal communication. We think that dialogue is talking, right? One talks, the other one talks, seeking together. But one of the things that came through very strong at l'Arche when we did the evaluation is something that we called the only presence, the single presence. So they tell us a lot of stories in the communities of l'Arche where with handicapped people, sometimes there are people who are unable to express themselves verbally, or who, when they do, it doesn't come out clear. So dialogue becomes, this verbal dialogue becomes truly limited. Anyway, what happened was that there is a way of creating communion, living communion, that is presence. I would say presence with the other, by way of presence. And in our society, in our society, we've lost the value or the importance of the exchange that does not necessarily come out through words or that is verbalized, but it comes through the body. And I think that's where our human nature and where nature itself can teach us a lot, because nature doesn't speak words like us. So I think it allows us to rediscover the importance of the physical, of the body language, of this, what I call this unique presence, this presence alone, singular presence that creates communion. To be present to someone, just taking the person by the hand, and you know, many times that can be far more relevant than many words that we might say. So anyway, I think that community is also this place or this space where we can share and where we can enter into dialogue, not only through words. The questions that are related to understanding. I'm going to propose another word. For interdependence, I propose covenant. For communion, I propose another word from Pope Francis, and in the Joy of the Gospel, his writing The Joy of the Gospel, and he talks to us about an image. He gives us an image where he speaks of unity. Two images, really, to demonstrate how communion, what communion should be, what it shouldn't be. So these two images are very meaningful, very relevant. He says, when we talk of unanimous, we think of the world, you know, we think of a sphere, right? And it's like a big ball. And that's one way of thinking of unity, of communion. But the problem with the sphere, he says, is that every point loses its singularness, its unicity, its uniqueness. So every part of the sphere is the same, and every point of the sphere is at the same distance from the center. So there is unity that becomes, in my mind, uniformity. And he says that unity should not take the form of a sphere, but rather the form of a polyhedron. You know what a polyhedron is? The polyhedron is an image or something that has many facets, like a diamond, for example, right? It has many facets. It's a singular unit, but made up of many facets. So every part of the, or every point of the polyhedron maintains its identity. Each point is at a different distance from the center. So the polyhedron is a unit that maintains the difference of each part. And so he was saying that unity has to be thought of as a polyhedron rather than as a sphere. And I think that there's a wonderful image of the community there. I like that a lot. To say that communion, the community, should not erase differences. What the community should do is allow each person to be different. The community is this place, this space where we allow for dialogue between our differences. So that's what communion is about. It's not the fact that we would suppress, erase, do away with differences, but it is this place or this space where we are allowed to enter into dialogue with our differences, or allow the differences to enter dialogue with one another. So there were many questions here. We're talking about the components of dialogue, how to create a collective conscience, how do you go from what is due to gift, what is due, what is gift, and there's this other non-negotiable that we talk about. Many, many questions about how do we bring community together, how do we create community with all of these elements. So I think that based on this polyhedron image, I think that I would be able to come to certain ideas of what the type of dialogue would be that would allow for us to create the community without it becoming uniform. There's three things I think that would be extremely important in this dialogue. The first thing is each one has to be able to feel recognized in their differences. Recognized in their differences. I think that we have to allow people, help them to become different, to be different. The community is a place where we have to feel we have the right to be different. We're part of, we belong to, but we are singular, we are unique with our differences. And I would even say that the community should be the place where each one feels that they can share their uniqueness, their potential, their specific richness. So for dialogue for me is this place where we recognize each one as being different and helps each one to be themselves. Empowers them to be themselves. The second idea, in order to enter into dialogue, I believe that we have to start with the idea that I don't have all the truth, and that I am incomplete, and that I need the other, and I need the truth of the other. So dialogue is that which allows each one to kind of like be fertilized by the other. It's not just what empowers me to be myself, but dialogue is what allows me to be enriched by the other, to be fertilized, like I say, by the other, because I realize that I don't know everything. And that's where dialogue empowers and it sort of like renders fruitful. And the third element, dialogue and community, is this experience which at the same time displaces everybody, each one. It's this experience that transforms each one. It is this experience that allows the experience to be greater than oneself. Dialogue and the community is an experience of transcendence. Because, you know, it allows us to be something greater. So do you see how that empowers, how that it renders fruitful and transforms and transcends even. So it allows it to go elsewhere, to be elsewhere, to be with others and touch upon something that is far greater than what I carry or have within myself. So anyway, those are some of the elements that I think might be interesting for us to think of dialogue and to create community, to become community that takes the form of the polyhedron and not that of the sphere. Well, that's it for the second point I wanted to talk about in the communion, which is polyhedron and dialogue. My third point is the relationship with religious life. Like yesterday, I want to kind of like relate idea of communion and dialogue with the vow of obedience. I think that, like I was saying yesterday, as I hear it from the outside, obedience for me is an invitation to interdependence, an invitation to co-responsibility, an invitation to say, not that someone decides and all the others follow what they say, but it's to say nobody decides alone. obviously that there are different functions, different levels of responsibilities, because we are different. But precisely because there is this interdependence between these functions and this uniqueness, the singular nature that makes up the whole. Anyway, for me, obedience, the way I understand it, is kind of like to say, I recognize that I am incomplete and I am permanently enriched by the others. So I realize, I recognize, I accept the fact that in order to live, I need the others. And therefore, that I am, like I say, fulfilled or kind of like enriched by the others. And I talk about fertilization of the other, no? And so I talk about obedience from that perspective, and I think that it might invite us to think in religious life, you know, perhaps think of different forms of belonging, different forms of interdependence. I'm thinking of this at two levels. In community experiences, but I think today it is the reality of the religious congregations, where religious congregations have taken on different forms. Sometimes we have big communities, sometimes it's small communities, sometimes it's people who live alone, but who form community with another group, even if they're all not under the same roof. And so I believe that there was all kinds of richness, all types of forms of community life that have been developed in religious life, and that is a demonstration that community is not only living together under the same roof, okay? So I'm thinking there is something there, but there might be something interesting that we have to continue to look at, reflect upon, deepen, and to see how the community might take on these different forms. However, I believe that there might be something to be thought of in terms of future. I know that I'm going to touch something that is very, very delicate. It's very touchy. But for me, it's a big question mark. I'm wondering if religious life couldn't consider proposing to certain people a sense of belonging that wouldn't be definitive, okay? And here we're talking about the question of the vows, final vows, okay? Temporary vows, final vows. You know, the model of religious life is the one of a perpetual commitment, a lifelong commitment. But I'm thinking, when I see today the younger generations, I work a lot with students, and oftentimes, and we were talking about that the other day at table here while I was here, sometimes I hear people who say, oh, young people today no longer want to commit themselves. They're not ready to take a lifelong commitment, you know? So anyway, what I see around me, I would say, I don't see that. I don't see that. I don't see the lack of capacity to be able to make a long-term, lifelong commitment. But I think it's a form of commitment that is different from ours. I see young people today as making a commitment for a year and give themselves totally during that year with the capacity that's unbelievable to invest in themselves, but for 1 year. And the next year, they will make another commitment. And so they leave themselves the possibility of being able to do some research, invest themselves differently, experience different things. But I mean, with their total being, it's an enormous level of investment. And so I'm thinking, when I look at that, for me, it's not the lack of capacity to make a lifelong commitment. It's not the incapacity to be faithful to a project. For me, it says something different about fidelity. It says that we remain faithful to something in them. It is very deep inside of them, but that takes shape in different modalities and different types of commitments. You know, today in the world, you look at the world of work. In the past, before To have a job was to remain in the same career your entire life and to be able to carry out the same career in the same company in the same business. And that was everybody's dream. Work and stay in the same place forever. Today, it's not anybody's dream anymore. There's no young people who dream of that. Their dream to be able to succeed in the work world is to be able to experience different things. Mobility has become a value in itself. So it's not, for me, a sign of the lack of capacity or fidelity to commit themselves. But could religious life propose something? Because the experience of community life, the way that you live it, has something wonderful about it, has something wonderful in terms of formation and that. But would it be possible for us to propose ways of belonging that are not definitive in themselves, that do not require a lifelong vow? So the question, I'm putting it out there for you, but for me, question of communion, interdependence, community, obedience, for me, allows me to ask the question. I'm just putting it out there very openly, and I know that there are many of you who would want to receive specific terms for people. No, you feel people have to come and stay forever and ever, amen. But it's just to say that I think that we got to come out of this binary model, either lifelong or nothing. I think it's necessary for us to think in terms of a greater diversity. I wonder if that's why, if we couldn't think of models of belonging that are different. Anyway, that's where comes the second word, that of communion. Oh, I've still got 15 minutes. 15, okay, 15. My third and my last word, future. So with this word of the unexpected, like there are many questions there, and yesterday afternoon also, with the questions that were given to us in writing, the unexpected. Let me tell you a little story to begin with, as I usually do. Okay, another framework, okay? We're in France, in the eastern region, in Pinal. Anybody who knows France might know where Pinal is. It's in the eastern region. And it's a rural community. We're in a rural area where I was able to go and be, and I went to talk, and I had heard about this story, and I said, oh myself, this is such a wonderful story. In this rural area, so families that are a little bit dispersed space-wise, and so a group of persons who said to themselves, or said to each other, we have a problem in our community here. In this rural area where we live, we have families that have children, and they're having a lot of trouble getting their children to school and back. So we said, they said, maybe we have to find a ways to be able to help one another to get our children back and forth to school. So anyway, they started saying, okay, so we'll get a project set up and we'll build a bus. Well, not build a bus, we'll buy a bus. We'll get some fundraising and we'll buy a bus, a school bus, so you know that happens, that's the way things happen everywhere. So anybody gets involved, they go to the municipal offices, and they present to the municipality, and the mayor says, of course, the need does exist, I agree with you, you're very right. And so he gives them the grant. And so the association buys the minibus, and they hire the driver, and things are going like really well for 1 year, okay? Little bus goes, picks up the children, brings them to school, brings them home. Perfect. Next year, the association says, oh, it went very well, so let's go back to the municipal offices and let's go and ask the mayor and say, well, look, could you give us this grant again to help us, financially speaking, so we can continue? And so the mayor says, well, no. This year I cannot do that because, in fact, this year we've changed our priorities. Last year, childhood was the priority. And today it's senior citizens. So you can't have money for everybody. normal. So this year, our priority is going to go on the side of senior citizens. Okay? Too bad for you, but we just don't have money for you. I mean, this answer is so legitimate. They weren't mean. They weren't being ugly. So anyway, that's where they find themselves with no money, unable to continue with their school project. What do? They think about that, and they said, yeah, we can go and get money elsewhere. Maybe we can get another funder. But what they did is something else. This I find just fantastic. They said, okay, we're going to propose to the municipality another project with the same bus. In our rural area, we know that there are many elderly people who are isolated and have a lot of trouble getting to town to be able to do their shopping. So we said, let's propose a project for the use of our minibus. On Saturday, we're going to go and get these people and we'll bring them to town so they can do their shopping and then bring them home. So anyway, they present the project, same minibus, same driver, different people in the bus on Saturday. The mayor says, okay, great. So the minibus, from that moment on, is used for the children and for the elderly. Why do I want to tell you this story? Why do I think it's so great? Well, it's because there was the refusal on the part of the mayor's office, which sent the question back to the people, and they said, well, what can we do to change the situation, you know? It's kind of like the limit. It's the obstacle that forced the people to create something new. So it's true. They found a way around it. A kind of a ruse, you know, and allowed them to develop something new, to create something new that they probably would never have done because it was going very well. It was meeting the needs for the children. It was fine. They would never have done it if there would not have been the refusal for their funding. So anyway, this little story for me is very meaningful to me, and it speaks to this idea of the unexpected. The new, the unknown, is always associated to some type of an experience of limitation, of an obstacle. You know, I was saying yesterday, remember when we were talking that there were two forms of life and two forms of death, and we said the two forms of death is by continuity, by renewal. And remember, when everything's going well, you're in continuity. It's going well. Things are just kind of like moving ahead on their own, so we produce what is going well. It's only normal. But when we have to do it differently, when does the question rise? It arises because we have a limitation when things what we were doing is blocked. It's not working anymore, and it's only then that we really ask the question, how can we do something differently? So therefore, for me, this unexpected, this unknown, usually comes to us when we are experiencing limitation, something that blocks us, limits us. And now we say, okay, can't continue like this anymore, what we were doing, because now we have an obstacle. So how can we go about this differently? That's me, to initiate. That's what I think when it means to initiate a process. Questions where we say, it's the experience that was used by Pope Francis that I quoted yesterday, where we had the question of saying, what does it mean to initiate processes rather than to possess spaces? That's what it is. For me, that's what it means to initiate a process rather than to just inhabit a space. So when you're confronted with something that doesn't work well, or it's not going the way we thought it would, you have to start something new. You have to initiate something to create the possibility of newness, rather than try to create the conditions so that we can do the same thing and keep repeating the same things over and over again in the same way. So that's what it means to initiate a process, to take possession of the space. And when we're talking about the little story that Chirac told us, it was to get funding elsewhere to be able to continue to do things the way they were always doing them. We'll go get money elsewhere and we'll continue with our doing the same thing. Not what they did. They said, okay, we got a refusal, so let's do something new. Let's try something different. And so that's what it means for me to initiate a process. It is to begin something, to take advantage of the limitation, of the obstacle, take advantage of the darkness, the obscurity. We're talking about the night, of this obscure night, in order to bring about, to allow to emerge something new. Allow something new to emerge. So, the concept that I would like to associate with this idea of the unexpected is the idea of promise. You know, I talked about covenant for interdependence, polyhedron for communion, and now I'd like to promote promise in echo to the unexpected, as an echo to the unexpected, okay? So promise gives us a little bit of a kind of like a leeway towards the future. In the Bible, there's wonderful things that are said about the promise, right? It just transpires throughout all of Scripture. So that's why I want to refer back to little stories, but that are very well known, but for me are very meaningful and very clear, and they tell us what the promise is all about. You know, the promise that God makes to Abraham: leave your country, go and to the promised land. You will arrive at the promised land and you will take possession of this land. That's what he says to Abraham. Abraham does exactly what God says. Trusts God, gets up, leaves. Very difficult, going through the desert anyway, but he gets there. He gets to the promised land. Contrary to what God had promised, he's not going to be able to take possession of this land. He's going to die there as a foreigner, and he's even going to have to buy a little piece of land to be able to bury his wife. So this is a promise that is fulfilled halfway, okay? Half. With Moses, it's even worse. Moses, God says to Moses, go, the people are slaves now in Egypt, get them out of there and lead them to the promised land. I'm going to guide you, and you're going to come there. And you know Moses is going to die before getting there. So I would say a promise that hasn't yet fully been accomplished. So what do we do with these promises that are not fully realized, that do not come to fruition? Is God one of these politicians, modern politicians, that promises? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that these stories are very meaningful and talk to us of the promise. They say promise is not necessarily a goal to be reached, but that the promise is what sets us in motion, moving towards something possible. The importance of the promise is not the goal, but is the setting out. You see how different that is? That's what the two stories say. It's what moves us away from, gets us out of. There's something new they're looking for, that's more life-giving. But the idea is not to get to the promised land. That's not the goal in itself. It is what gets us up, moving, going, walking, and I think that's what it means to initiate a process. That's what it means to think of the future. I had quoted Paul yesterday, St. Paul. You know when he says, hope what we know. If we hope we know, it's not hope. To hope is to desire something that we don't know, hope for. So we move and we set ourselves in motion towards something we don't know. So we cannot determine the goal before getting up and setting out, but it's what gives us the strength to get up, to start walking, to set out. So that's why I put promise, as it resonates with the idea of of initiating a process, rather. There's a lovely question here that said, how can we guide people towards an unknown future, a future unknown? Great words. Guide, you know when you're guiding people, it's because you're usually leading this person to a goal. So how do you lead them to something you don't know, as is unknown? So I think that that is a little bit what we are called to do today. I very much insisted since yesterday on the idea of kind of like just not always be so taken up by the final result, but of this model to be reproduced, but to set out, to move out towards something that we don't know, that we might not see. Well, definitely not. And that we believe is going to be able to bear fruit and bring greater life. I think that that is where, for me, this word of the watcher, to be the watch, to watch, takes its full meaning. I think that the guide here is, first of all, the person who watches for and guides the other towards the unknown. It is to create this space where we watch together, rather than to say, this is what you have to do, this is what you don't have to do, this is the way to do it, this is what not to do. But to ask ourselves, how can we develop our capacity to watch together, to be the watchers, to bring life to these new seeds of life, to see where life is beginning to kind of like bud forth. That's what I mean, guiding towards the unknown, to see step by step, what is it that allows us to take the next step, to go a little bit further. You know, there's an author from Uruguay, he's called Galliano, and he has a wonderful definition of the word utopia. He says utopia is like a lady standing before us, and she's on the horizon, okay? And the utopia is that woman, that lady, and so we take one step towards her, she takes one step further. We take 2 steps towards her, she takes 2 steps further. So he says, what is utopia for? What is it useful for? That's what it's useful for, to walk, to move. The utopia is what's before us. That's what the promise is all about. And something that is not something that is impossible or that has us leave our reality. That's not what I'm meaning when we talk of utopia. Utopia is a promise. The promise that we do not know, the goal that we do not yet know, but that keeps drawing us forth, keeps us moving. And I think that's what it means to guide towards the unknown, to develop and to kind of like develop this capacity to be watchers, so that we can go a little bit further, to always feel we are moving towards something. Oh, I'm sorry, okay. The time is going by. Give me 3 more minutes, please. I mean, time is superior to space, she says. Can we take 5 more minutes? Everybody's saying yes, we can.
Yes. Okay.
There's another author, an Italian, who worked a lot on the question of community, and he says something beautiful about community. He says that community, you know, when you talk about community, that we can say it for religious congregations as well as for national or civil communities or whatever. He says in general, we think that what we have in common, our common knowledge, our common history, our common roots, our common this, our common heritage. The community is determined, the national community is by a common history, a common legacy. Patrick, that's not what creates community, he says. What creates community is not what we have in common, but what is lacking to our common. It is this common lack, because the community is defined by the fact that like we can have a common future. It's not our common history, it's our common future. To recognize, to realize that there is something missing together, and that this common lack is moving us out towards our common life together. So that's a little bit what I'm talking about when I talk about utopia. Utopia is a lack. We haven't reached it yet. We haven't got it yet. But it's pulling us forward, setting us out towards this better place. And my last point, very quickly, is the relationship with religious life. And like I was saying yesterday, I have this question of the unexpected, of the future with the vow of chastity. Because what I'm seeing in the vow of chastity is this invitation to be creative, to create in a multiple facets beyond biological reproduction. So how can we be creators? And so there was a question that asked, how can we be creative and not just consumers? To be a consumer is the one who always wants to acquire more and more and more ideas, things. And I think in our institutions, we're like that. We accumulate competence, skills, how to do things. But the idea is to say, to be creative, to create, is to recognize what is lacking, because that is what puts us in motion, moving us towards something better. I think that today, you are very conscious of what is lacking, eh? When you say, you were talking about the question from last night, too, that is very present to you, when you said, well, religious congregations today, particularly in northern countries, don't have as many members, we're getting old and downsizing. And so that lack is something that you feel very clearly. It's very obvious. So how can we think of the future when you think of this lack? So obviously, I have no solution, and I don't pretend I have it. All I want to do is share with you what I believe, what I think. In the future, there will be a religious life. There will be consecrated life that's going to be very, very different from the one that exists today. It will exist. And I believe that you won't see it, and I won't see it. But you are, like today, you are kind of like the ones bringing birth, giving birth to this new religious life. You won't see it, but you can make it possible. And in order for that to happen, it's important to identify what it is you want to communicate, share, transmit to those who are going to invent this new religious life of tomorrow. I believe that what we have to communicate or to transmit is not an institution, nor is it a mode of life or a lifestyle, but it's the breath that brought us life, that engendered us, that gave us the desire to commit ourselves in the institution where we are today and to belong to this lifestyle. It is this breath that we have to protect and to keep, and this is what we have to be able to transmit and communicate. And this breath, this life-giving breath today, we have to think of in terms of the other people who are around us, who work with you, but might be those who are going to be those who are going to pass on this religious life of tomorrow. The lay people with whom you are working, that are the communities of the South, with whom you are in relationship. And I think that there are questions that you have to ask about the type of relationship with lay people and the type of relationship with people in the South. What are you transmitting? What are you conveying to these lay people, to us who are around you, and to these communities of the South that belong to the same congregation as you belong to? What are you communicating to them? Are you communicating the breath of life? Like I'm saying, for example, I'm thinking of communities who work a great deal with lay people, those who are with the elderly and healthcare. Thank God that there are people to have taken up from what you initiated and set in motion in hospitals and schools and everything. But sometimes I feel the lay people and the communities of the South are considered little children by you. I think that you have to treat them as adults, as true partners. They're not little hands that you have to take in yours and continue what you began. And I'm not saying that. I'm thinking that there is something here that we have to continue to deepen, to look at, to reflect upon, and probably that there are new forms of interdependence that have to be set in place. Obviously, you are different. It's not to say like you have to take lay people for religious. It's very different. But I believe that there are relationships, links, bonds, and that the breath will be communicated in as much as You treat these people, consider them equals, partners, more than people working who can give follow-up to your project. Anyway, that's it. These are all ideas, things that I'm putting out there, questions that I'm wondering about, that I'm sharing with you with a great deal of honesty, and I hope that you felt it is very important. For me, religious life is very important for me. I have learned a great deal. I have been granted a great deal through what you initiated, and that's why I want to share all of this with you, things that I did share, and that I think that this night, that is not only your night, it's the night of the world, it's the night of our society. It is what I tried to say yesterday, how these nights are true bearers of this newness, this possible newness, how these nights, this darkness, call us to become watchers so that we can create a new world. Thank you very much.